Hello, everyone. This is André Fauteux of La Maison du 21e siècle, 21st Century Housing Magazine. Today, I'm very honored to have Dr. Meg Sears with us today. How are you, Meg?
I'm just fine. I hope you're doing well there in your beautiful rainbow land.
Yes, in the Laurentians, north of Montreal. It's wonderful. We've got snow coming. Are you in BC?
No,
In
no, I'm
Ontario?
on the outskirts of Ottawa.
Oh, okay. You're not so far from
Mhm.
here, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I want to speak to you about the environmental aspects of chronic diseases and cancer in particular. And so you're the chair of Prevent Cancer Now. Tell us a little bit this. I'm sorry about formation, of course, it's training. It's LinkedIn, my French version. Tell us a little bit about yourself and Prevent Cancer Now before we start.
Okay, I'm originally trained in chemical engineering, applied chemistry, biochemical engineering, but life happens, and I became very interested in environmental health and in things like pesticides. I had young children. I did not want them to be made sick or anything, and
Mhm.
so I became very interested in environmental issues. I was with a group that we formed to protect a wetland close by that was going to be wrecked by a golf course. So I learned a lot about ecology and also about the law. And then eventually I became connected with Prevent Cancer Now because I very interested in environmental contributors to disease and health. And so I joined the board, and quite a few years later, I became the chair of the board. So I'm also working as an epidemiology sort of explorations. I'm with the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute.
Mm.
So I bring my chemistry knowledge and toxicology together with epidemiology. So at least I can interpret these things and see the gaps and the where things are actually true as opposed to misinterpretations because it's tricky.
Yeah, it's
And
tricky business,
and
biostatistics.
we're very interested in contributors to cancer that because I think you'll agree that cancer is one of the leading costs for healthcare, and it's costing us, a lot of money, but it's also costing a lot to society. Canada is one of the world leaders in cancer incidence, which is not a position that we would like to be in.
No,
And
certainly
that's
not.
because of the types of environments that we're living in and the very laissez-faire attitude towards chemicals and adverse effects in products in our daily lives,
Well,
etc.
that could be very surprising to a lot of people, what you just said, but I'm not necessarily surprised. If I can tell you very quickly about myself, I started at the Gazette as a reporter in '88, where my first front page was about a little girl with leukemia.
Oh,
And I investigated since 1988 environmental causes of diseases, including pesticides and electromagnetic fields. And later on, I discovered Quebec had the highest incidence of cancer in children, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14 back then. So why would that be? You say it's really the laissez-faire, it's the attitude of the politicians. We think we're in a clean country, of course, Canada.
well, yeah, and really, there are not very many people compared to the landscape and so on in Canada, but there is a Canada has a lot of agriculture. If we want to talk
Mhm.
about pesticides for a minute, Canada has a
Yeah.
lot of agriculture, and one of the concerns that is front and center this week, actually, we just put out a press release about it, is corporate capture, basically.
Yeah.
You hear about corporate capture in other countries. Europe has made a huge investigation several times into corporate capture. This is not a news story, but
And is it just lobbying? What can you define
no,
corporate
no,
capture?
we have representatives. The thing is, a regulator has to work with the chemical company. That's their
Yeah.
job, is to work with them.
Yeah.
So the way it works for pesticides in Canada is that we have the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which is under Health Canada, and they have to collect the data from the manufacturer, from the representatives of, say, a brand new pesticide that's supposed to kill weeds, for example. So, in order to make their regulatory assessments and everything, they're beholden. They have to have that data from the only data holder, which is the company that's making this patented chemical. Um, but there's problems in that the initial science is going to be very heavily biased because it's all sponsored and vetted by the chemical companies. That's the source of your information up
Mhm.
front anyway. And then there's actually a lot of I might say interference. There's a lot of talk back and forth about interpretation of that information as well. For instance, if you just want to talk about the world's most used pesticide, which is glyphosate, it's sold as Roundup. It kills weeds, and we have plants that are genetically adapted to be resistant to glyphosate. So if you're having corn or soybeans or oils and so on that are grown in Canada, unless you buy organic, which has very strict standards and testing. If you buy organic, then it should be a lot safer. But these all will have some level of glyphosate in them.
Yeah, it's
And
everywhere in the air, the water, the soil. We're all ingesting it every day.
yeah, well, like where you are, there's probably not all that much glyphosate because Quebec is very enlightened and it does not spray glyphosate on its forests.
Oh,
Whereas, yeah, in Ontario and other provinces, they use glyphosate and other herbicides in forestry as well.
okay,
But
but we have lots of fields everywhere, north, south of Montreal,
mhm.
full of glyphosate too.
Well, and other chemicals. I'm just taking that as an example
It's
because
the most used in the world.
it's the most used in the world, and it's been around since the 70s. So we actually do have some evidence about it now.
Mhm.
And it does cause cancer, but glyphosate is a fascinating chemical because it came after a lot of these chlorinated chemicals, the Agent
PPCs,
Orange, 2,4-D,
PCs.
2,4,5-T, picloram, all these other herbicides. They were all had lots of chlorine atoms on them. And that chemistry tends to produce persistent organic chemicals that we know cause cancer and all sorts of other things. So as somebody who knows a bit about chemistry, when I first saw the little chemical structure for glyphosate, I thought, wow, like this is fantastic. It doesn't have any of these chlorine atoms. It's
Okay.
such a simple little molecule. It's kind of an analog of an amino acid. It looks a bit like an amino acid, but it obviously has very different effects. But it is also patented as an antibiotic.
Really?
So there is a direct connection between the microbiome and all
I
of
was going to
the
say leaky
yeah.
gut. Hmm.
That's a very direct connection. It's patented for that. And it's
Hmm.
also patented as a chelating agent. And a chelator is a chemical that can kind of wrap itself around a toxic metal and pull it out of the rock and into the water. And one of the toxic metals that we have a lot of in Canada is just, the luck of the draw, and is high actually in Canadian potash as well, potash fertilizer, is cadmium. And cadmium is its chemistry is a bit like lead on steroids. It's quite toxic. Um, so
It pulls it
when
into the plant. It takes it in the soil and it pulls it into
so
the
it
plant.
takes it into the water and it takes it
No.
up into the plant,
Oh,
and it chemically it's a little bit like calcium. So where calcium would go, this big fat atom goes there instead. And so we know that when glyphosate is used, we have higher levels of cadmium in grains. We have higher levels of glyphosate, obviously. And another wrinkle with it, since it is an antibiotic, it actually changes the microbiome of the soil. And instead of having a really well balanced microbiome in the soil, you end up getting a lot more fusarium, which is a fungus, and it's a toxic fungus. And so you have more fusarium in your crop as well when you've used this. So
Oh,
it's pretty complicated. It
yeah.
isn't as if glyphosate is like a bullet out of a gun. It does one thing.
It's
It has
indirect.
all of these other implications and so on. So
Uh-huh.
at the PMRA, they do nothing. They never
Pest
look at
management,
cadmium.
pest
They never
management,
look. Oh,
PMRA.
the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. That's under Health Canada, and that's the group that is responsible for assessing and regulating pesticides. Unfortunately, they're really a pesticide management regulatory agency because
I was going to
if they
tell
were
you,
really focused on pest management,
yeah,
then they would be really working towards doing what I think they should be doing, which is figuring out the least toxic way to
yeah.
manage
But
pests.
I have
But
an anecdote for you on this. I met, my God, Elizabeth May many years ago,
oh,
talking about the toxicity in Nova Scotia and all that, and how it used to be Agriculture Canada in charge of the
mhm.
certification of pesticides and all that. And to make it look good politically, they shifted it to Health Canada. But she said it was the same management, same employees, they just changed offices.
Yeah, they put a new sign on the door, really.
Yeah,
It's complete.
exactly.
It is completely corrupt. Actually, yesterday we had a press release about a letter to Minister Holland, the Minister of Health in Canada, um, talking about the corporate capture at the Pest Management Regulatory Agency.
Is
There's
there another angle that there's also the revolving door syndrome, which often people from industry who work for the government and then go back to industry afterwards?
We don't have as much evidence of a revolving door as we have lots of meetings, and the PMRA will propose something which is more science-based, and then the chemical companies have a lot of input into what does this science really mean? And so they say, oh, no, no. So they're always shedding doubt,
Okay,
and
but
then
in how is Quebec, Canada's civil servant more captured than in other countries? Give me another example.
I'm not
Uh,
sure that they're more or less captured. What happens is that in some countries, like in some European countries, the citizens are much more engaged and much more knowledgeable, and they have way more people than just the people involved with Prevent Cancer Now. We're a very, very small group who are engaged in looking at the science that's coming out.
okay,
They have independent science and so on.
yeah,
So certainly coming out of Europe, they have a different system, and they have quite frequently lower levels of pesticides that are allowed. Not
mm.
always. There's been a lot of effort towards harmonization now. So,
No, I
we're
understand. We need more scientists and citizens involved politically and scientifically and in the
well, and we
media.
just need to have honesty in the science. People have to understand what the science means,
Hmm.
and it has to be properly translated. But the PMRA is very, very close with its data. For instance, there was a new herbicide that came out, and the latest fad in pesticides is not. They recognize that we recognize that chlorinated pesticides are bad because they tend to be more persistent and so on. But you've probably heard about PFAS, all these perfluorinated chemicals. Guess what?
Teflon.
We've got loads of pesticides that have these fluorinated groups on them, and
Mm,
they actually break down into a chemical that's on the list that's supposed to be banned. Um,
mm,
and you know, Environment Canada has a list, but Health Canada refuses to recognize that this vast number, is probably over 100 by now, fluorinated pesticides are actually approved, in quotes, by them. And so they're on the market. And this is a different type of chemistry. So it takes a while for resistance to develop. So
mhm.
these things are seen as just, the greatest thing since sliced bread because they haven't been around long enough
Yeah.
to have a lot of pest resistance. But
Well, I'm interested that you're speaking about PFOAs and PFAs because Dr. Leonard Hardell answered the question I sent to many of you because I just had prostate surgery. I've been writing 30 years about cleaning up your home and your lifestyle. So I was wondering why, and I'm an athlete, why I should get prostate cancer. And one of his answers, I met him in Brussels in 2015. He's one of the world's leading environmental epidemiologists and also an oncologist. So he treats people. And when I met him in Brussels, I asked him about his background, and he started, you mentioned Agent Orange, PCBs, glyphosate, and now cell phone radiation. He's one of the pioneers who identified all of those as higher incidence, epidemiological biostatistics, saying it's possible, probable, and sure carcinogens. And he answered that for prostate cancer, PCBs and PFOAs and pesticides are involved.
yes, yeah, certainly and with prostate cancer, breast cancer, and so on, there's another wrinkle in there in that these tissues are very sensitive to hormones. And so we also have a whole bunch of chemicals that mimic hormones. And so they
Endocrine
will
disruptors.
bind inappropriately on these hormone receptors and trigger more rapid growth. And if you've got more rapid growth, there's more opportunity for mistakes to be made, and you're more likely to develop cancer. So
Yeah.
I just saw last week that the European Food Safety Agency, no, it isn't agency, it's not association. What is it? EFSA. They were looking at BPA, bisphenol A, which is it's in all of the hard plastic clear water bottles, and BPA is a very, very common chemical. And
Polycarbonate.
pardon? Polycarbonate.
Polycarbonate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a polycarbonate. It's used for
Mhm.
polycarbonate.
So that's
And
one
BPA has
endocrine.
been kind of suspicious. It's People have been suspicious about BPA for quite a while because it can interfere with estrogen receptors. And so EFSA has now published that they were out by a factor of roughly 20,000 in estimating the estrogenicity of BPA. And there's a lot of it's a very wide margin of error there, but they were out by orders of magnitude. And so BPA is a lot more estrogen, it is a lot stronger estrogen mimic than it was anticipated to be. And this I would expect to apply not only to BPA, which is one of the most common chemicals in daily life and leaches into, whatever's in the bottle. You should never put hot liquids in a BPA bottle. And this is in lots of children's baby bottles and everything. But once it came out that there was bad news about BPA, there's a lot of other bisphenols. So we have a whole alphabet soup of bisphenols. We have BPA and BPX. And anyway, there's a
We
lot
should
of them.
all, yeah, we should all wonder why we're putting food and water in plastics, and there's always a risk of leaching.
Yeah, yeah. And there's certainly some that are a lot more inherently safe than others.
Mhm.
But BPA has been highly suspect from the get-go. And we now
Mhm.
realize that somehow or other, for some reason or another, whatever the scientists were saying kind of got morphed into a uh, much more lenient interpretation of the data. And so now we're facing a lot of a rapid increase in cancers, particularly in younger people. If you ask the statisticians, they'll say, well, overall cancer rates are going down in Canada, but that what is causing cancer rates to go down is the early detection and then excision of precancerous lesions, in quote.
What's
So
good prevention?
it's secondary prevention. It's not primary prevention. Primary prevention is when you don't have
But,
those
but
lesions.
it's beneficial
Secondary
prevention.
prevention is snatching it early
Yeah.
before it's, really it has a high malignancy. So so
Early
you have to be
detection
pretty
and
careful
treatment.
about the statistics. It's true that in Canada now we're seeing a very rapid increase in more aggressive cancers in younger people. So the
Hmm.
statistics are showing that that's where the increases are very fast, and it could possibly be the result of exposures very, very early in life, and perhaps even to the oocyte, which is the egg in um, the mother's egg before it's even fertilized. So early life exposures may be responsible for, in part, for all of these increasing cancers that are leaving young families with one parent who is sick and it drains all the savings, and they're sick, they can't work it, and then single parent families. It's tragic, just horrible.
Yeah, it's very tragic. The little girl I mentioned, and also my neighbor when I grew up who had leukemia, the couples break down. Of course, it's very hard for parents to go through such a thing when children are sick or one of the parents. And so there's this debate of what part does the environment play and genetics. I want to go through maybe one at a time with you. It's very um, anytime anyone gets sick, it's always tragic. I had a friend who had breast cancer. Now, I'm always publishing stuff by email and on Facebook and what have you on prevention, what you can do. And she answered that it's cruel to say, maybe I'm the one who caused my breast cancer. And I'm not saying that at all. Actually, I'm saying the opposite. And one of my heroes was Dr. Samuel Epstein, who died of heart disease at 92. And he created a cancer prevention coalition. And he was saying that actually the cancer industry being, for instance, the National Cancer Institute and everyone, a lot of these groups and scientists who are finance often their research by polluters, they keep pretty quiet about the risks of the pollution, of course, that these companies may be making. And even some of them make the pesticides and the, the medication that'll treat the cancer that may be caused by it. But if we could go through one at a time, this question of genetics, is it about 5 to 10% of cancers that are have a where genetics have a main role? And what type of specific cancers do you know? There's like certain breast cancers which have a higher genetic
Yeah,
proportion.
this is a really interesting question because the answers keep becoming more and more nuanced. Um, if you had a very high, if you had a DNA that was just, you were just bound to get cancer, then you probably wouldn't have kids, right? Like
Yeah.
you probably would,
Or
so
you'd see the same
the most
cancers in identical twins would have the exact cancers and they don't.
exactly, yeah,
It's
we
really
don't see that.
lifestyle. No.
So but then of course, there are some people who are working in, say with radioactivity who may get direct DNA damage.
Mhm.
But then there's also, we understand now that the DNA is not just a cookbook with, for all of the different in- amino acids in your body. The DNA is actually it's the cookbook, but it also has bookmarks. It has jams sticking together some of the pages, and all of these all of these bookmarks in the jam, they can get put in when the egg is formed. They can get put in at any stage of your life. And that can change your basic physiology in some way or another. It may just change the kinds of protein on the lining of your gut, for one possibility.
Mm.
But
And genetics also are not a sure thing. You can change your genetics even with your thoughts, your emotions, how you deal with
well, you
stress.
can't change your DNA.
Uh,
Um,
there's how the expression of DNA does change with
the expression can change, but not
the
the genetics.
base, not the basic, yeah.
Mhm.
So will they be turned on or not or off, those genes?
Exactly. Those are
Yeah,
the bookmarks in the jam.
yeah. So that's the expression if you're turning them on or off. Uh,
Yeah, they
I'm
can be expressed or yeah.
yeah.
But we so now we realize that these exposures can change that. And then we also recognize that genetic that the DNA, the use of the DNA is not 100% perfect. So if you have very rapid turnover, then you're more likely to have some kind of mistakes along the way and have so rapidly growing tissues or tissues that are stimulated to grow rapidly,
Mhm.
then you are more likely to have mistakes in your DNA, and that may lead to cancer. So right now, we're seeing that people generally are bigger. And now the cancer doctors are even calling it a cancer phenotype when you see these much bigger people that are obese. Um, and so this again, it goes back to hormones that are triggering the growth of cells and the growth of the body and so on. Um, but it's of course the DNA that has to produce, the DNA is the cookbook for every single cell in the body. So that's important too. And
But what's the
so
angle of people being bigger? Because I saw prostate cancer is, for instance, in taller people more
yeah, yeah.
often. Because
Yeah,
you have
so
more
taller
material.
people are more likely to get cancer. And we don't
Be,
know exactly why, but in order to have that much more growth, there's going to have to be that much more stimulation of the certain cells. And whatever cell is going to be replicating has to be stimulated more.
mm,
So, like we see in some very small creatures that it's very unlikely that they get tumors. And of course, they probably have very much shorter lifespans as well. So
yeah,
there is
they're
this
off
kind of
time.
going across species, and that is another whole issue.
Yeah.
But then for chemical testing, of course, we don't, feed babies possibly toxic chemicals to see how they grow up.
Yeah.
So we do rely upon animal testing. And now there's a lot of work that's been done moving from the animal testing to in vitro just with cells, and then even just looking at the chemistry itself
Mm,
and using, much smaller types of tests, smaller
mm.
scale, rather than with living organisms.
Let's talk about kids because they they're growing rapidly. They have several vulnerabilities. So we see more and more disease, they're more vulnerable. And it's not in that sense, you can't say it's better diagnosis because most child diseases, you will see it, except there's a debate over autism, if it's better, different methodologies and coding. But when I started writing about indoor air, quickly I learned that the rate of asthma in Quebec quadrupled in 15 years. And one of the links was because homes became more tighter,
Mhm.
but they didn't, even today, they're not installing heat recovery ventilators with good designs and good installations, like in R2000 or Energy Star or Nouveau Climat Homes here, or Lead Homes. So we're trapping
Mhm.
pollutants, more moisture, more mold, more bacteria, what have you. But following, I don't know, you must be aware of Epidemic Answers, a group in the US. We're doing amazing, amazing work. It's
Mhm.
hundreds of parents and scientists, healthcare practitioners working together to heal children who are, their doctors are doing what they can, but they're saying, well, you're stuck with these diseases. You're going to have these chronic diseases your whole life, and we can't do much about it. One out of two kids,
Mhm.
and the statistics are really alarming. And so they really showed that cleaning up the diet, the air, the water, their homes, they really have amazing, amazing results. Uh,
Absolutely.
so I highly recommend, and people can download it, can view the interview with her. Uh, Actually, I didn't put the link on this slide. Let me just show the other slide. In the PowerPoint, I have the link for people to see. If I can just show it again. And so I want to ask you, what are you seeing in children? Here's the link, epidemicanswers.org webinars. And so I want to ask you, are you seeing, is it exaggerate to say it's really a public health crisis? All these diseases in children and in young adults. How worried are you?
I'm very worried about the kids these days. If you watch them on the street, then they look different. They are learning differently. If you talk to teachers in schools, the children are not learning the way that children used to.
Yeah.
And some of it will be diet. If you look at the quantity of sugar that they're eating, a very interesting study just came out looking at a change in the phenotype, kind of the overall body and the cancer incidence in the UK, because there was this kind of controlled study that was not set up as a study, but sugar was rationed in the UK until about 1956, something like that. And then sugar was not rationed. And so there was this like instantaneous doubling almost in the population of the quantity of sugar that was being eaten. And that was another kind of birth cohort effect where they went from, there was a large increase in chronic diseases and in cancers that was coincident with being in utero and having young life with the lower quantity of sugar as opposed to the higher quantity of sugar. And certainly the quantities of sugar that children eat today is way more than they should be. But it's not just the sugar, there's a lot of additives, and the food now is all wrapped in plastic. And we've already talked about plastics. And not only is it the hard plastic part, but all the plasticizers, because they add chemicals and it's just mixed in and they leach out really easily. Things like phthalates, which are also hormone active.
They're in
Hormone.
PVC. Yeah, if you have PVC blinds or shower curtains, it's that soft plastic.
Yeah, because PVC itself is rigid. It's kind of brittle. But then they add this sort of oily stuff to it. It's called a plasticizer. So it
Yeah,
makes this hard, brittle thing more like what we think of as plastic.
yeah.
But there it shouldn't be PVC used in food packaging anymore. But
But it's in our
so
air. We should get those.
we have hundreds of thousands of chemicals that are in use now that our great great grandfathers and grandmothers never, they simply weren't in existence. So we really have a very different environment today. and of course, if you want to talk about a different environment, we've got the different environment because of climate as well, which is, that's another whole discussion. But as
Yeah.
far as chemically goes, our children are eating foods that contain things that we never ate as young people. So, we see this dramatic difference just adding sugar to the diet. And sugar is something that our body knows what to do with. It might not handle excessive amounts all that well and
Mm,
predispose to diabetes and so on.
mm,
But that's it's not really a straight comparison to all of these synthetic chemicals that are persistent and
mm.
can interact with a lot of hormones in your body.
What are the consequences of sugar in terms of behavior and learning? It's hyperactivity,
Yeah.
concentration loss,
Hmm.
mm.
Yeah. So,
Aggressive behavior also.
oh, yeah. And it's a lot of impulsivity, which means that they're not paying attention. They can't put ideas together. And they may behave in a way without really thinking through. So they can be crueler, they can be a little bit more violent. You know,
Mm.
there's a whole range
Yeah.
of
I know
possibilities.
that lead does that. Heavy metals will have those effects also, making children more violent.
Yes, yes. Now we've done a reasonably good job of dealing with lead. There are still lead supply pipes,
Mm,
and going from the main water supply to the home,
mm,
you can have sometimes there's lead pipes there. People can see where the feeder line comes into their house, and
mm,
they'll be able to see if it's lead or not. It's a very dull gray
mm,
pipe,
mm.
but and generally that simply goes from the house to the road or wherever the mains are. But that's something that if you do have a lead pipe, that can be changed out
Yeah,
and
Montreal is
should
doing
be.
that. They're changing them, but it's taking years to change that connection to the homes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they knew in the 70s and 80s that lead was bad for it
Yeah.
was clear then. And not only that, like studies
Was
have shown that blood lead levels were associated with violent behavior and criminality.
yeah,
And um, so there was lead not only in pipes, lead in paint,
gas.
that and gasoline.
Hmm.
Yeah. So actually, there's still lead in aviation fuel for this
There is it.
anti-knocking thing.
Okay.
So about 20 years ago, there was a study, and living underneath the pathway for the airplane to land, the flight path coming into an airport, living under a much used flight path for small airplanes increased the amount of lead in the garden soil and so on. So it would
Mm.
probably be not the best place to be growing your own vegetables.
Reminds me that I grew up in Beaconsfield. I wasn't right next to the highway. It was at the top of my street. But where you see the highway, you also see the trains go by, and it's Dorval Airport. It's on
Mhm.
that path. And all around the island, you have the high tension power lines up to 735 kilovolts. So it adds up, all those things, unfortunately.
That's right. And
Yeah.
of course, one of the exposures that children today have is to all of the tech, um, and a lot of it's wireless. So,
Hmm.
there's the content, and then there's also the potential for exposure to the radiation, to the radio frequency radiation.
Tell me how you became interested in electromagnetic fields.
Oh gosh, I have to try to think back. Well, I've always been interested in it. Like when I was in high school, I was interested in the idea that plants would grow better if they had a magnetic field around them. So
Yeah.
actually, my teacher said, "Oh, well, set up an experiment and see." And so I had my experiment all set up, and that was great. And then the janitor promised during the Easter vacation to water them both, to water my plants. And I came back, and the one inside the coil, it was
Mm.
completely dead. He says, "Oh, there was electricity there. I wouldn't water that one." So,
It reminds me of the bushes killed by smart meters. There's holes, sometimes it's red in the cedar bush.
oh,
right
Well,
where their
well,
beam's
this was
coming in.
this was simply that the janitor was afraid of my coil and didn't want to get electrocuted or something. So I
Yeah.
don't think it was really an experiment that proved anything other than beans need to be watered.
No, yeah. I
But no,
should.
so that's really interesting. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms um, by which radio frequency or microwave radiation can affect tissues. And the first
Oxidative
time I heard
stress.
about the possibility that microwave radiation could affect possibly biology, although it wasn't in the context of biology, was when I was working as a summer student at the University of Toronto. And somebody else in my lab was talking about experiments using, because when you want to do a chemical reaction, quite often you'll heat something up. So, your mother is probably the best cook in the house, right? And how do you cook? You put it in a pot and you put it on the stove and you heat it up, right? So, microwave radiation is a much more efficient way of heating than having a steam coil or something in the middle of a reactor. So people started looking just at using this, and they realized that using microwave radiation, you could get much better chemical production under some circumstances than you would ever expect just from the heating. It was clearly not just from heating. And
Mm-hmm.
this is just plain chemistry, it's not biology or anything like that.
Mm.
And then there was somebody who went and looked at a huge number, I think it was over 1,000 chemical reactions, and found that, yes, indeed, a lot of these reactions went much more quickly if heated with microwave radiation. And this is a tiny fraction of the energy you would need to use if you were actually just heating with, like something that's
Mm.
hot. And so now they've actually got some medical tests that will go much more quickly. So you can get a medical test in minutes instead of having to take like 8 hours for a complete reaction. And they realized why this happens. And you have to know a little bit about chemistry. But if you want to have a chemical reaction to take place, you need to have the energy in your mixture go up. And then when you reach a critical point, it's called the activation energy, then the chemical reaction happens and then it can cool down and you've got a different chemical. But there's something called an activation energy. You need to put things together hard enough or whatever. And if you, instead of using just thermal heat, you use microwave energy, you reduce that activation energy. So it happens much more quickly and at a lower energy. So there's actually, a benefit to if you want to do chemical reactions. Um,
Mm.
and you need to have the other thing that they did was they looked at this phenomenon and they used tiny oil droplets within water. So you've got a surface where this reaction will take place, which is a bit like the inside of a cell or something. And they found that certain reactions in these oil droplet systems went much more quickly with much lower energy. So when people say, oh, well, there's not enough energy in a microwave or radio frequency, which is the same thing,
Mm.
radiation from a phone, I think, well, we don't know that. Just because it's not making your ear super hot, and it might even do that, that has nothing to do with the activation energy because we know that reactions can occur at much lower activation energies using this kind of radiation.
Well, that's it. It's not just a question of power. It could be frequencies and many, many other factors. When I was in Brussels, let me just show you a few of my references. For chemicals, I recommend this website, of course, Environmental Working Group. Among the first scientists who studied endocrine disruptors, created it. And so
Mhm.
for different consumer guides, it's really amazing for chemicals. But in terms of EMFs, electromagnetic fields, there's the power line frequencies in our homes, but also you're talking about the microwaves, which is not just the oven, it's your Wi-Fi and what have you.
Mhm.
And I had the honor actually of participating at a distance in this great symposium at Women's College many years ago. So if
Mhm.
people want to read a bit about the science, I invite them to check out these proceedings of the symposium on the Women's College Hospital
Yeah,
website.
actually, I participated in that, and there's a brief description of
Okay,
microwave catalysis in my section in
oh
that.
great, you were one of the speakers, eh? Sorry, I didn't
Yes.
remember. And when I was in
It's a small
Brussels,
world. Eh?
yeah, yeah. When I was in Brussels in 2015, Dr. Belpom invited me to cover it. Igor Belayev was the greatest scientist I ever met in my life. He's a Russian trained in Moscow, and he teaches in Stockholm, and he's uh, in Bratislava. Actually, he's based, and he's the one who explained to me all the different factors which uh, can make microwaves or 60 hertz magnetic fields beneficial or harmful. And
Yeah.
all of these studies, financed by industry, don't take these into consideration. But this is really, he's going out on a limb and actually very solid when he says that if this guy's saying that microwaves and smart meters can cause cancer, people should really listen because he was awarded the best uh, paper award over a whole decade in a scientific journal about EMFs. He's really maybe the top scientist, EMF scientist in the world today, certainly in the top 10.
Mhm.
And I think, Sexit was one of them. Trying to find where he mentioned all the here we're talking about DNA damage and repair, but just looking for the here we go the different factors right here.
It's kind of small to read on the screen.
So frequency, bandwidth, modulation, polarization, dose, duration, coherence time of exposure and of non-exposure, the natural environment of electromagnetic fields, density of cells, genetics, gender, age, individual differences and other physiological characteristics of subjects, the presence of metals, antioxidants, free radical scavengers such as melatonin and ginkgo biloba. So all these factors play on whether you're going to react to EMFs. And of course, people don't react instantly. It can take hours or days. But so these are among things I recommend people read. And another great website is Physicians for Safe Technology, and of course, the Environmental Health Trust in terms of EMFs.
Yes.
So time flies. We have a bit more time. I don't know if you're in a hurry, but tell me a bit about the studies you're showing because there is this debate about is cancer really increasing or not? You mentioned it's the fact that we're diagnosing and treating earlier. What else is affecting the statistics? There's great debate over this. You sent me great papers from Nature, a clinical oncology. I
Well,
can just show the paper you sent me, one of them.
hmm yeah.
What would you
Well,
like to say
it's
about
this
this?
this is statistics, right? And
Mhm.
so if you want to look at the all of the cancers around the world, people are tending to live longer, and
Mhm.
cancer has typically been a disease of aging.
Mhm.
So, if people are less likely to die of heart attacks, less likely to die of diabetes, they're living long enough to develop cancers. But we are we have concentrated a lot of effort into early detection of these cancers. So people are less likely to die of them. But now, so that's all of the older people. And it's still true that that's the majority of the cancers in the world. But the tragedy that we're seeing is in the younger people because these are young parents. They're, maybe still in university. They're at the beginning of their lives. They're pulling together their families and so on. And now we're seeing that that even adolescents and young adults that didn't used to develop cancer are now developing this. And so that's why in Canada we have the early age onset cancer people who are, have big groups and are working on earlier detection and so on. So I spoke with them just a couple of weeks ago, and they were pulling together a symposium, and we're saying, look, primary prevention is just the way, that's where our concentration has to be. We People look upon cancer as sort of this horrible fate that came out of the clouds or something. Well, maybe it did, but
Mm.
they philosophically rather than physically. And we realize that there are environmental contributors to cancers. There are environmental causes. If we're seeing a change in the statistics, if we're seeing all of a sudden a whole bunch of people are getting something, then and some people are even calling it an epidemic, although it's a very slow moving epidemic compared to something like COVID. Um, there's an environmental cause. There's a cause. People's general makeup hasn't changed, like the physiology and so on in people in general. That's, we've evolved over millions of years. We haven't suddenly taken a major step in evolution in the last 40 years.
Mm.
So this is environmental. It's probably multifactorial, but there are a few key mechanisms involved. And these mechanisms have to do with the signals that are used to dictate basically how cells are going to operate, whether they're going to be senescent or whether they're going to be actively growing and reproducing and this kind of thing. So,
So that communication between cells is affected by chemicals and electricity also, right?
yeah, between, but also within the cell. So is this DNA going to be activated to produce proteins so that the cell will be growing, or is it going to be more quiescent?
Hmm.
Is that cell going to respond to produce hormones or to produce enzymes to metabolize sugar, say? Um, how strong a signal does it have to have before it will produce enzymes?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of this biochemical signaling, messaging going back and forth. And if that's not perfectly aligned, then we have people who are growing bigger, people who are more likely to be obese, people who just don't have the energy to get off the couch. And yes, it has to do with their immediate environment, but it also has to do with this sort of biochemical programming that is imposed upon them by these changes in the DNA, these what they call epigenetic changes. So they're not changed genes, but the instructions that the genes are going to follow, the signals that they are going to trigger the genes to be replicated more, not replicated, but to be activated so that they are actually being used. That
Yeah.
changes.
Am I wrong, right to say that epigenetics is how the environment and your lifestyle, like a new software, which will change the hardware of your DNA and how
Yeah,
it works?
that's not completely
Yeah.
that's one analogy. Yeah.
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 I didn't make it up. I read it recently. But if we come back to the genetic factors, there seems to be a consensus that it's only 5 to 10% of cancers. Are we beginning to see a consensus? It's impossible to know, but how much does lifestyle versus pollution play? Because we're seeing a lot of people who are moving, they're not all fat and all sitting down all day, though I realize being a journalist at the computer all day is not good. Even though I play tennis 4 hours a week, my wife is really pulling me out in the woods every morning now, an hour every morning, which is really good. The
Good for
morning
you.
sunlight is amazing. Yeah. But how much your field with your experience, what percentage of cancers are caused by pollution on average, would you think? Would you
Oh,
suspect?
now that is really hard to say,
Mhm.
because it goes down to even what you call pollution.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
certainly if you can control your sleep and what you eat, what you drink, what you're breathing is tough because there's Roundup and everything else all around. Uh, and there's also the fear aspect, the psychological aspect. We don't want people
Yeah,
to
well,
panic.
it's like psychology, your attitudes and so on, getting out and exercising, all of that sort of thing is super important. Some people put that on the environment side because you basically make your environment. If you being asleep in your bed is an environment as opposed to you being out in the club having um, that's another environment. So this is a very fuzzy kind of question to try to figure out where is this dividing line between
Mhm.
environment and um, but a large a large part of it is environment, but there's a lot of in your environment that you really don't have any control over, you know. Um, so there's only so much that an individual can do. There are
Exactly.
choices that you can make consciously.
Mhm.
There are choices you don't make because you don't even realize you have a choice. Um, if a child is going to school in a school where they have a very high output router and the desk is right underneath it, that's an unconscious choice. But um, so that's why we really say that we have to make least toxic the norm. Generally, in Canada and around the world, the regulatory agencies say, well, basically, in chemicals or various environmental exposures are sort of innocent until proven guilty. Um, One of the issues we look at is asbestos in drinking water. And right now, Health Canada is taking no action in spite of the thousands and thousands of kilometers of asbestos cement water pipes that are reaching the end of their lives and putting asbestos in drinking water,
Oh,
if
yeah.
that happens to be the kind of pipe on your street. It's not everybody.
Mm.
Um, but
There's a link to respiratory disease
there's certainly a link to respiratory disease, but
in
what is
water.
tested is whether having asbestos in your drinking water is a problem. Because at one point they produced a huge number of asbestos reinforced cement pipes. And these were lighter and more durable than some of the other pipes, and they were cheap. And Canada was it's an asbestos capital. And so we had lots of asbestos. So they actually mixed asbestos in with the concrete and made drinking water supply pipes with this material. And
Mhm.
now they're reaching the ends of their lives. These pipes are eroding and they're putting asbestos into the drinking water. Back in 1992, in the US, they regulated the amount of asbestos in drinking water.
Okay.
And just in October, there was a paper published. It was sponsored by Health Canada, and they said, "Oh, we still don't think it's a problem because we don't have consistent, convincing evidence that drinking asbestos is bad for you." And I said, "Well, this is a completely ridiculous standard. We don't have that standard in law. This consistent, convincing evidence that a known human carcinogen, when you breathe it, is you have to do that." So in
Mm.
Canada, we have all these pipes that are falling apart. They're actually costing us a huge amount of money because instead of being replaced, in a systematic way, it's all emergencies. A majority in a lot of communities, the vast majority of drinking water breaks, the pipe breaks that, so people don't have any water, there's floods, they have to, the roads are closed and all sorts of things. Rather than doing this in a civilized fashion, it's all done on an emergency basis.
Yeah.
So that's costing us. They say, well, we can't afford to replace all these. Well, you're going to replace them anyway. You can either
Yeah,
do them systematically or you can just,
with
be
climate
constantly
change.
running around trying to sweep up a huge, much more expensive mess.
Hmm.
Um, and again, with cancer, treating cancer is hugely expensive. And yet we can't afford to have safer food. We can't afford to have safer water. We can't afford to have pollution control so that the air is cleaner. I don't buy that. I think we can't afford the cancer.
No, we're seeing our hospital systems breaking down. Yeah. And as people get older, also, the cases are heavier.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Hmm.
it's a burden on on individuals, on society, and on our healthcare system and on our bank accounts.
Yeah.
Cancer is
Well,
very, very expensive.
yeah. Well, I agree totally with you. I'm a bachelor of political science. That's what I did before journalism. And it's the same thing with climate change, everything in the environment. It's not about just doing your recycling and buying an electric car. We need political action. It's not just individual practices. We need collective action and policies to change things.
Yeah, and people don't accept as reality what scientists say. They accept it when it's on their doorstep.
Yeah,
So my neighbor today was saying, "My goodness, I never expected this kind of thing to have green grass, a month before Christmas." And people, well, they say that a sick man has one wish, a healthy person has 1,000, right?
yeah.
It kind of focuses your mind to
Oh,
have
yeah,
some
for
kind of
sure.
emergency. But
Yeah,
why, with our advanced intelligence, can't we focus our minds before we are faced with an emergency? And so it's absolutely true. Prevent Cancer now works on climate issues because wildfire smoke that causes cancer. All
yeah,
of the, water pollution and air pollution and the lousy food and the stresses and climate change causes cancer.
for
And
sure.
a whole lot more. It's actually an existential crisis, and it's something that Canada and much of the world really is not dealing with nearly as much as it should.
Yeah, I think they're going to be selling a lot of HEPA filters in coming years. It's incredible when you see forest fires from BC coming to Quebec or Quebec's fires going to New York. It's all over. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So we have to really try to make in our own lives, make least toxic the norm. So, if you can do it in a simpler way, if you can make one trip instead of two in your car, if you can turn down the thermostat or use less water, hang your laundry out, and really importantly is just to not use stuff that you don't need. Like I have never understood for my entire life how adding something to your wash to make your clothes stink makes them cleaner.
yeah.
Like there's some things that we do
It's
that
all
really,
about
if
marketing.
you stop and you asked your 3-year-old, they would kind of look at you with a puzzled look.
Oh yeah.
So
It's
there's a lot of things that we can simply leave on the shelves. And if enough people do that, if enough people choose the safest, then eventually the companies are going to learn
yeah.
that, yeah,
Well, it's human nature that we do wait for emergencies to react. So it's it's a good side to the epidemic. So many kids and adults are sick that now adults are acting. Just in closing, I'd like to give a few of my own references. This is a Google translation of an article of an epidemic answers document called actually The Path to Recovery and all the different recommendations to consumers. And it's based on notably on the recommendations of neuropediatrist Martha Herbert at Harvard, who's an autism expert. And EMFs reduce your exposure to EMFs is one of the recommendations. And there's 5 or 6 recommendations in terms of cleaning up what you eat. So, and find a good practitioner. That's a toughie. And before we get to your website, people can visit Epidemic Answers or also marthaherbert.com. And tell us a little bit about what people find on your website, preventcancer.com.
Yeah, prevent cancer now. We're
I'm
impatient.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, well, basically there are three avenues in our website. First of all, there are some choices that you can make for yourself.
Mhm,
And so on the left-hand side, you'll see healthy choices,
mhm,
and there are healthy choices for the home and etc. Um,
mhm,
and but then there's a lot that's outside of an individual's control. And so therefore we pull together the information and we help people to reach out to their MPs and so on to do what is possible. There are, opportunities that come up.
mhm.
Um, what's happening right now is the Health Committee, the Standing Committee on Health for yeah, there you go. You got the website actually up.
Mhm.
Um, in Parliament, um, it's having a study on primary prevention of cancer. So, oh, this is an older one. So we have put together a brief, and we're asking people to. I think this is an older version, but anyway, we're asking people to reach out to their MPs and be in touch with them and tell their MPs that they want primary cancer prevention to be a much stronger focus for the federal government. And
Here I
then
search.
we summarize science.
Here we sit with a search.
Yeah, top left.
Primary cancer prevention. Here we go.
Mhm.
Okay. And
Yeah.
the third one is guided by science. So who do you work with? You're working with the Ottawa Hospital, notably.
Well, I'm a scientist, so I actually, I've worked with Environmental Health Trust and so on, but I have a position at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute,
Mhm.
and I've been working as a scientist in this kind of area for a very long time. People who are listening might not realize that in Canada, we have a policy under the Canadian Human Rights Act to accommodate environmental sensitivities. And so I authored the report that led to um, that
Yeah,
policy, the
I
Canadian Human
love
Rights Act.
that. That's how I discovered the great Meg Sears, those two reports for
Oh,
the Human Rights Commission. And the commission said it's not our policy, but it's really rock solid. People have to read in terms of the medical aspects and the political aspects of environmental sensitivities. I commend
yeah.
you on those great reports. But what's come of it? Because people with chemical and electrical sensitivities, uh, the charters say that, but the tribunals, there's never been any judgment in Canada. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's sometimes people are being accommodated secretly, so it's not public.
Yeah, and I honestly don't follow enough of that. The Environmental Health Association of Quebec
Yeah.
yeah, I've worked with Rohini and the people
Right.
there.
Mhm,
And I've also published with Dr. John Malott, who does a lot with them.
mhm,
And John actually worked with the Environmental Health Clinic in
mhm,
Toronto, and they did a big study on environmental sensitivities in in Ontario. So
mhm.
they had a task force on that. But you know, it's really tough to fight this kind of thing. And it's done, you're right, it's done on a case by case basis, but it's eventually what happens is that you just kind of knock on the door and knock on the door, and then suddenly the door will open, and you have to have faith that that door will open. And in the meantime, we are guided by science as it says on our website. All of our submissions are available on our website. They're very strongly referenced with peer-reviewed literature. So we put forward the scientific case and also just the common sense case. So we one of our recommendations is to use principles that were actually originated in Europe for under the Canadian Human Rights Act. This is how general chemicals are regulated. So, we're back to the bisphenol A and the triclosan antiseptics and so on. And we're saying, look, we can't possibly have rigorous science on so many chemicals because you've got too many variables and not enough data. You will never have enough data. So this is kind of the get out of jail free card for the chemicals because they'll say, oh, we haven't got consistent, convincing evidence. Well, no, you are not. And if the government is never collecting the evidence that would be needed to be assessed to to provide that very, very high evidentiary bar, flip it on its side, on its back, and say, well, is there a ethical imperative for the government to be collecting that data, or for the government to require that level of data to prove safety? Because certainly there's no proof of safety. All it is, you have not got evidence that has kind of emerged from that great hubbub of all of the chemicals, all of the variables. And so we don't actually have an ethical or effective way of managing chemicals. And it's getting worse by the minute because now we have so many thousands of chemicals that it's impossible.
Are you working with SEPA, the Environmental Physicians Association? Because I think people should be optimistic nonetheless, because,
Oh, CAPE, you mean?
well, CAPE, yeah, CAPE.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
I collaborate with CAPE and my name's on some of their
okay, Canadian
yes.
Association of Physicians for the Environment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
SEPA is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. All of
yeah,
these acronyms will catch you,
yeah.
eh?
Sorry. No, I want to say that, politicians and heads of industry and physicians, they're not immune to disease, of course. And so some of them do wake up one day and act. I think, was it for BPAs that Canada was one of the first countries to ban them or
No, no. BPA
regulate
is
them?
not banned in Canada.
There
Oh,
was, or not phthalates, there was one
they
chemical.
they took it out. They took it out of baby bottles.
Okay. So
But
sometimes they
it,
do act. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, but you have got no idea what's in the dollar stores.
Yeah. Oh,
And
that's incredible.
and
Yeah.
as I say, there are so many very similar chemicals that are used
Uh,
that it's doing any kind of regulation, chemical by chemical, it can get tweaked just a little bit,
yeah.
and then it will still be perfectly good to make plastics. It will still have the same toxicity. It's got a different name. And so you have to start all over again.
Yeah. And
And you
there's
can
no
only collect
inspectors.
that information after people have been hurt.
Yeah. And there's no inspector in the dollar store, federal inspector or provincial. Yeah.
Actually, you know something?
Mm.
Dollar store people have been caught selling pesticides. So the PMRA actually has, these reports of its enforcement. It has almost zero enforcement, but they have caught dollar stores selling illegal pesticides.
Because
So there you go.
consumers complained, or they just went at a chance and they inspected.
I don't know the backstory. They just say that they found this. They,
Okay.
you
Well,
know,
certainly
it's
consumers
like
should be
one little
vigilant.
paragraph, they went and found some dollar stores, actually in Quebec. This is years ago. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, so who knows? And just because it's not at a dollar store doesn't mean that you can be any more assured these
No.
days. These
But
big
actually, we've got millions of
supply
inspectors
chairs.
out there. Citizens should be inspectors, do their reading and complain to government. It does work when there are complaints and enough complaints also.
Yeah, yeah. But you're making choices. So can you make an inherently safer choice?
Yeah. So what else, what other references do you recommend to make those choices besides the Environmental uh, Illness Association? ASEC,
Well, actually, in our under making, we have a section on the website,
yeah,
making choices or something like that.
just trying to see their main
The
website,
first box on the left.
homepage on your website.
Yeah. Healthy choices, it's called,
Yeah,
up near the top.
that's it. So people go here.
Hmm.
Right. Okay.
And of
Well,
course, it could have so much more content. And we really welcome if anybody would like to help out, if they're interested in our work. We're a very, very small group but mighty group, very heavily science-based. We're pretty hard-nosed about that, but certainly we would, yeah, that's making healthy choices. So you can make healthy choices with what you drink, how you carry out your daily life, exercising, all sorts of things. Um, yeah.
okay. Well,
Yeah,
Meg
so we
Sears,
welcome recipes. We welcome anything, and you can reach, prevent cancer now. We wear our heart on our sleeve, .ca because we're Canadian, and you can email info@preventcancernow.ca to get in touch with us. And so we certainly welcome help and inspiration. And really, we feel that if people get in touch with their MPs and the MPs do it or realize on a personal basis that there are reasons to make change, that's really what they're there for. So
well, Meg Sears, thank you very much for taking the time today. You're the chair of Prevent Cancer Now, based in Ontario, and it was really wonderful speaking to you today.
thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Take good care.
You too.